And now on Radio 4, Derek Jacobi reads The House of Silk. Some 100 years after the death of Sherlock Holmes, a manuscript has been discovered in the vaults of Cox & Co. in Charing Cross. It recounts the events of a missing Sherlock Holmes case, written up by Dr. Watson for the sake of completing the Holmes canon, but considered too monstrous to be published in his lifetime. Only now can the full story be told.
It was in the last days of November 1890. London was in the grip of a merciless winter. I was glad to be in, with a fire blazing in the hearth, the familiar smell of tobacco in the air, and, for all the clutter with which my friend Sherlock Holmes chose to surround himself, a sense that everything was in its right place. I'd telegraphed my intention to stay with Holmes for a short while, whilst my wife was away. It was as if the last 2 years had never happened, that I'd never met my beloved Mary, married her and moved to our home in Kensington. I could have been living here with Holmes, sharing the excitement of the chase and the unravelling of yet another mystery. My thoughts were interrupted when Mrs. Hudson ushered a man into the room who was formally dressed in a dark tailcoat, wing collar and white bow tie. He reminded me of some of my patients, the ones who refused to believe they were unwell until their symptoms persuaded them otherwise. He stood before us with equal reluctance, while Mrs. Hudson handed Holmes his card. "You must forgive me arriving in this unexpected manner, Mr. Holmes. In truth, I had no intention of coming at all. I've come into town for the opera. Not that I'm in any mood for Wagner. But when I told my accountant my troubles, he urged me to consult you." "I'm happy to give you my full attention," Holmes said. "This is Dr. Watson. He's my closest adviser, and I can assure you that anything you have to say can be uttered in his presence." "Very well. My name, as you see, is Edmund Carstairs. I'm a dealer in fine art. My gallery, Carstairs and Finch, is in Albemarle Street. We specialize in the works of the great masters, and over the past 6 years business has flourished." "Your partner, Mr. Finch?" "Tobias is rather older than myself. If there's one disagreement between us, it's that he's more conservative than I. However, I won't tire you gentlemen with a lecture on art." Holmes nodded. "Pray, continue." 2 weeks ago, I realized I was being watched. My home, Ridgeway Hall, is in Wimbledon. From my dressing room I have a view of the village green. It was here on the Tuesday morning that I became aware of a man watching the house. I was struck at once by his extraordinary stillness. He was too far away for me to be able to see him clearly, but he was wearing a long frock coat. I was in America last year, and from the style of it, I'd say that's where he originated. What struck me most forcibly, however, was that he was wearing a flat cap, of the sort that's sometimes called a cheese cutter. His eyes were fixed on my window. They seemed to be boring into me. I gazed back at him, then went down to breakfast. However, before I ate, I sent the scullery boy out to see if he was still there. He was not. The green was empty. "A singular occurrence," Holmes remarked. "But Ridgeway Hall is, I'm sure, a fine building, and a visitor to this country might well have found it merited examination." So I told myself. But a few days later, my wife and I were leaving the Savoy Theatre, and there he was on the other side of the road, unmoving, as the crowds passed on either side of him, as if he were a solid rock in a fast-flowing river. "Did your wife see him?" "No, and I didn't wish to alarm her by making mention of it." "This is most interesting," Holmes remarked. "The behaviour of this man makes no sense. On the one hand, it's as if he's making every effort to be seen, and yet he makes no attempt to approach you." "He did approach me the next day when I returned early to the house. There was the rogue, approaching my front door. I called out to him, and he ran towards me. For the first time, I saw his face, thin lips, dark brown eyes, and a livid bullet scar on his right cheek. He didn't utter a word, but lifted a note into the air and pressed it into my hand. Then he ran off. "And the note?" The art dealer produced a square of paper with 6 words written in block capitals. "St. Mary's Church, tomorrow, midday." "Was the message folded when it was handed to you, Mr. Carstairs?" "No, I folded it myself later." "The picture becomes clearer by the minute. This church he refers to, I assume it's in Wimbledon?" "Just a few minutes' walk from my home." "This behaviour lacks logic, don't you think? The man wishes to speak with you, but he doesn't utter a word." "Well, my guess is that he wished to talk to me alone. As it happened, my wife Catherine had been standing in the breakfast room and had seen everything. She thought he was some gypsy wanting money and advised me not to go, so I reassured her." "You reassured your wife, but you went to the church anyway?" "Well, exactly, but he wasn't there. I paced the flagstones for an hour." "The man is known to you," Holmes said. "You go right to the heart of it, Mr. Holmes. Although, I confess, I don't quite see the reasoning that brought you to that conclusion." "It strikes me as self-evident. And you still haven't told us the significance of the flat cap. Mr. Carstairs, you mentioned you were in America a year ago. Was this when you met the man in the flat cap?" "I never met him, but I know who he is. My foeman is called Keelan O'Donoghue, and I wish to heaven I'd never heard the name. 18 months ago, I was introduced to a Bostonian by the name of Cornelius Stillman. He was in London at the end of a lengthy European tour. Like many wealthy Americans, he was imbued with a sense of civic responsibility and was constructing an art gallery in Boston, which he planned to fill with the finest works of art. Well, I was overjoyed when he agreed to come to my gallery. And the long and the short of it was that he bought a series of 4 landscapes by John Constable, which were quite the pride of our collection. We parted on excellent terms. The paintings were carefully crated and shipped to New York, where our agent James Devoy met the package and travelled with it on the Boston and Albany Railroad. But the paintings never arrived. There were in Boston at this time a number of gangs, and one of the most active was the Flat Cap Gang. It was headed by a pair of Irish twins, Rourke and Keelan O'Donoghue. The two of them were never seen apart. Rourke was the larger, barrel-chested with heavy fists. Keelan was smaller. Both wore flat caps. It was also widely believed that they carried each other's initials tattooed on their arms. The Flat Cap Gang had been tipped off that a large amount of currency was about to be transferred from New York to Boston on the Boston and Albany Railroad. The banknotes were contained in a safe, and by some wretched chance, the paintings were travelling in the same compartment. The gang held up the train in a forest outside Boston. Our agent approached them and was gunned down. Moments later, a huge explosion rent the air, and the entire wall of the mail carriage was blown apart. The guard was killed instantly. The vagabonds snatched up the banknotes, not caring that they'd left 2 men dead, and completely unaware that their explosives had utterly destroyed 4 canvases, which were worth 20 times the money they'd taken. Finch and I heard the news with horror. It was fortunate that we were insured, or we'd have been wiped out. But there was also the matter of the loss of the paintings, and James Devoy's family. I left for America straight away. I met Mrs. Devoy. Her son was 9 years old, and a sweeter, more good-looking child would be hard to imagine. Then I went to Providence, where Cornelius Stillman had a summer house. Over dinner he assured me that the city fathers would take care of Mrs. Devoy and her child. Encouraged, I went on to discuss the Flat Cap Gang. Might it not be possible, I suggested, to offer a reward for information as to their whereabouts, and to hire a private detective agency to apprehend them? Stillman seized on my idea and insisted on funding the full cost himself. He contacted Pinkerton's and engaged a formidable investigator called Bill McParland. Advertisements were placed in the Boston Daily Advertiser, offering a handsome reward. The size of the reward achieved its aim. McParland was given a tip-off. The O'Donoghue twins were holed up in a narrow tenement in a less than salubrious part of Boston. Keelan had one room to himself. Rourke shared his with two of his men, and a third room was shared by the rest of the gang. One evening, as they crouched round the stove, drinking and playing cards, McParland closed in, accompanied by a dozen armed men. The Pinkertons' agents had been instructed to take the gang alive, but when McParland took up his bullhorn and called out a warning, there was a volley of shots. Two of the Pinkerton men were gunned down, and McParland himself was wounded. But the others gave as good as they got, emptying their six-shooters directly into the flimsy wooden building. When it was all over, they found 5 men lying dead together, but one of the gang had escaped. Keelan O'Donoghue had squeezed through a loose floorboard into a narrow gully that led to the river. A slight concern arose in my mind. Stillman had made it public in that blasted advertisement that I had been party to the plot to track down the Flat Cap gang. It now occurred to me that to have killed one twin and to have left the other alive might make me a target for revenge. My passage back to England was booked on the SS Catalonia. I'd actually reached the gangplank when I heard the news shouted out by a newsboy. Cornelius Stillman had been shot dead in his garden. A young man, wearing a twill jacket and flat cap, had been seen fleeing from the scene. According to the article, Bill McParland was assisting the police, and there was a certain irony in this, as he and Stillman had fallen out. Stillman had held back half the fee that he'd agreed, arguing that the job wasn't fully complete until the second twin was caught. Holmes had been listening with a look of intense concentration on his face. There was a lengthy silence before he asked, "What was the opera you intended to see tonight?" It was the last question I'd expected, and I wondered if he was being deliberately rude. "A performance of Wagner. But has nothing I've said made any impression on you?" "On the contrary, I find it of great interest. You evidently believe the man in the flat cap to be this Keelan O'Donoghue. You think he's followed you to England to exact his revenge." What other possible explanation could there be? Offhand, I could suggest half a dozen. At this juncture, there's not a great deal I can do, Mr. Carstairs. If your unwanted visitor reappears, then I'll be pleased to assist you. I can tell you, however, that I don't believe he intends you any harm. But the very next day, the man in the flat cap struck again. My first impression of Ridgeway Hall was that it was a perfect jewel box of a house. 2 gates, one on each side, opened from the lane, with a gravel drive shaped like a horseshoe round a well-manicured lawn. The house itself was built in the Georgian style, with elegant windows placed symmetrically on either side of the front entrance. A smartly dressed manservant led us into the drawing-room, where Carstairs was sitting talking to a woman a few years younger than himself. He sprang to his feet the moment he saw us. "You told me yesterday that I had no reason to fear the man I believed to be Keelan O'Donoghue. And yet last night he broke into this house and has taken £50 and some jewellery from my safe. But for the fact that my wife's a light sleeper and actually surprised him in the middle of his larceny, who knows what he might have done next? I turned my attention to the lady. She was small and attractive, with an intelligent face, and despite the alarms of the morning, I guessed she had a quick sense of humour. There was something about her that reminded me of my own dear Mary. "Perhaps you should begin by introducing us," Holmes remarked. "Of course. This is my wife, Catherine." "And you must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I understand you've had a very unsettling experience." "It's as my husband told you. I was woken about 3:20. I thought at first it must have been an owl that had disturbed me. But then I heard another sound coming from inside the house. To be honest, it didn't occur to me that it might be a stranger. I thought it might be Mr. or Mrs. Kirby, or even Patrick. You know, I don't completely trust that boy, Edmund. Anyway, I came downstairs and looked briefly in the drawing room. Nothing had been disturbed. Then I opened the door to the study, and there was a figure perched on the windowsill. The two of us froze. Then he simply fell backwards onto the grass, and I raised the alarm. Holmes nodded. "Mrs. Carstairs, it's clear that you're American. Have you been married long?" "Edmund and I have been married for almost a year and a half." "We met on the Catalonia," said Carstairs, "the very day it left Boston." Catherine Carstairs reached out and took her husband's hand. I saw Edmund as he came on board, and I knew at once that something dreadful had happened. It was obvious from his face. "I don't know how I'd have lasted the crossing if it hadn't been for Catherine. The loss of the paintings, the death of Cornelius Stillman. It had all been too much for me. I have to say that I've always sneered at the concept of love at first sight, Mr. Holmes. But by the time we arrived in England, I knew that I'd found the woman with whom I wished to spend the rest of my life." As he turned to smile at his wife, another woman came into the room, and I saw at once that she was as different from Catherine Carstairs as could be imagined. "First I'm disturbed in my room by police officers asking absurd questions, and that is not enough? Are we to invite the whole world to invade our privacy?" "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Eliza. I told you I'd consulted with him yesterday." "And much good did it do you? We could all have been murdered in our beds." "This is my sister, Eliza," Carstairs explained. "You reside in the house?" Holmes asked her. "I am tolerated, yes. I have an attic room where I keep myself to myself." Holmes turned to Carstairs. "How many other people are there in the house?" "There's Kirby, our footman, and his wife, the housekeeper. Their young nephew, Patrick, came to us recently from Ireland and acts as kitchen boy. And there's the scullery maid, Elsie. The coachman and groom live in the village." At Holmes's request, Carstairs led us to his study. The safe was still open. Holmes examined it. The lock doesn't appear to have been forced, which would suggest that a key has been used. There was only one key, and I keep it with me all the time. Catherine keeps her jewellery in the safe, and I did have a copy made. "But I lost it a month or so ago," his wife said. "I wanted to open the safe and couldn't find it. I'm not normally so careless." "Could it have been stolen?" "I kept it in a drawer beside my bed, and nobody comes into the room apart from the servants." "You say that some jewellery has been stolen?" "Yes, a sapphire necklace belonging to my late mother. I imagine it would have little financial value, but it had great sentimental value to me. She lived with us here until a few months ago." Carstairs' wife laid a hand on his arm. "There was an accident, Mr. Holmes. She had a gas fire in her bedroom. Somehow the flame blew out and she was asphyxiated in her sleep. She hated draughts and always slept with the window closed. Holmes went to the window and examined the frame. The wood was splintered, and it had evidently been forced from the outside. "I'd like to speak to your man Kirby, and then I'll walk in the garden, though I imagine the local police will have trampled over anything that might have proved useful." "Inspector Lestrade struck me as being both thorough and efficient, Mr. Holmes. He's already ascertained that a man with an American accent and a scar on his cheek took the first train from Wimbledon to London Bridge at 5 o'clock this morning. We're certain it's the same man. I can assure you that if Lestrade's involved, he'll come to a conclusion very quickly, even if it is completely the wrong one. Good day, Mr. Carstairs. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Carstairs. Come, Watson." Kirby was waiting for us by the front door. He confirmed he'd been at Ridgeway Hall for 6 years. Holmes asked if the house had changed much during his time. He replied, "Oh, yes, sir. Old Mrs. Carstairs was very fixed in her ways. The new Mrs. Carstairs couldn't be more different. She has a very cheerful disposition. My wife considers her a breath of fresh air." "You were glad that Mr. Carstairs married?" "Delighted, sir. And a bit surprised. I wouldn't like to speak out of turn, but Mr. Carstairs had formerly shown no interest in such matters, being devoted to his family and to his work." "You were present when old Mrs. Carstairs died?" "Indeed I was, sir. A dreadful business." "Was the kitchen boy in the house at the time?" "Patrick had arrived from Dublin the week before. He's my nephew on my wife's side. We had hoped to give him a start in life, but he hasn't found it easy being in service." "Thank you, Kirby." Out in the garden, Holmes was in an unusually jaunty mood. "This is a remarkable case, don't you think, Watson?" "Well, it strikes me as quite trivial," I replied. "The sum of £50 has been taken along with a necklace. Not the most testing of your challenges, Holmes." "So, you've already arrived at the solution?" "Well, I suppose it all hinges on whether the unwanted visitor was indeed the twin brother from Boston." "And if I were to assure you that he was almost certainly not?" "Then I'd say that not for the first time you're being thoroughly perplexing." "Dear old Watson, how good it is to have you at my side. I think this is where the intruder arrived last night." We'd reached the point where the drive met the lane. There were footprints all around, but Holmes pointed to one set in particular. "These will be Lestrade's. They're heading in quite the wrong direction. He has, you see, entered and left by the gate on the right. The intruder, however, surely came in by the left. It's less conspicuous. If you were to approach the house without wishing to be seen, this is the one you'd choose, and, as you'll observe, we have only one set of footprints." "Hello!" Holmes crouched down and seized hold of the butt of a cigarette. "It's American, Watson, but you'll notice there's no ash, meaning that he didn't linger long." Holmes strode back to the window that we'd already examined from within. "Consider the height of it, Watson. He must have been a man of uncommon strength, and there's no sign of a ladder or a garden chair. We must also ask ourselves if it was a coincidence that he chose to break into the very room in which the safe was contained. Still, a sapphire necklace shouldn't be hard to trace." As we made our way back towards the lane, the front door opened, and Eliza Carstairs hurried out. "Mr. Holmes, I was rude to you inside, and for that you must forgive me. But I have to tell you that nothing is as it seems, and that unless you help us, we're doomed." Carstairs' sister flung an accusatory finger at the house. "She is the cause of all this. Catherine came upon Edmund when he was at his lowest ebb. After all he'd been through in Boston, he was in need of someone to take care of him, so she threw herself at him. And don't believe for a single minute that my mother died as a result of an accident. When Edmund announced his determination to marry her, when he refused to listen to reason, it broke my mother's heart. Of course we wanted him to be happy, but a foreign adventuress? My mother killed herself, Mr. Holmes. She couldn't live with the shame. And now this latest business. How do we know that this stranger hasn't come here on her account, rather than to pursue some vendetta against my brother? This is only the beginning of it, Mr. Holmes. So long as this marriage continues, we'll none of us be safe. And with that, she wheeled round and went back into the house. The following morning I was sitting reading on my own when half a dozen street urchins burst into the room and formed themselves into something resembling an orderly line. Holmes had once named them the Baker Street Division. At other times he referred to them as the Irregulars, and I reflected that a scruffier, more ragged bunch would be hard to imagine. Only one was a little better fed than the others, his clothes slightly less threadbare, and I wondered what wickedness had furnished him with the means. Sherlock Holmes appeared and addressed their leader. "Ah, Wiggins! I have instructions for you. Our quarry is an American, a man in his mid-30s, who occasionally wears a flat cap. He has a recent scar on his right cheek. Yesterday he was at London Bridge Station, and he has in his possession a sapphire necklace which he needs to dispose of. Now, where do you think he'd go?" "Petticoat Lane," cried a boy. "No, he'd get a better price at Flower Street," shouted another. "The pawnbrokers," interjected the better-dressed boy. Holmes looked at him. "What's your name?" "Ross, sir." "Well, Ross, you have the makings of a detective. If he's new to the city, he won't know any of the more esoteric corners you boys frequent. He'll go to the most obvious place, signed with the 3 golden balls. He arrived at London Bridge, so let's assume he's residing in a lodging-house close by. My rates are the same as always, a shilling each, and a guinea for whoever finds what I'm looking for." Holmes and I were with Edmund Carstairs and his partner Mr. Finch at their gallery in Albemarle Street when Wiggins rushed in. "We found him, Mr. Holmes. Me and Ross. He was leaving the jerry shop on Bridge Lane with his face cut livid by a scar. We followed him to his hotel, sir, Mrs. Oldmore's in Burmany. Will it be a guinea each if I take you there?" "It'll be the end of you if you don't," replied Holmes. "I left Ross there to act as crow. If your man steps out again, he'll watch where he goes. Ross is new to the game, but he's as canny as they come." And we hurried out of the gallery, Holmes, Wiggins, Carstairs, and myself, leaving Mr. Finch gaping after us. Mrs. Oldmore's private hotel was a dilapidated building, with windows so dirt-encrusted that barely any light seeped through. Ross was waiting for us, shivering with cold. As Holmes and Carstairs approached, I saw that something had greatly frightened him. Wiggins grabbed hold of him. "It's all right. We're both to have a guinea. Mr. Holmes has promised." Ross pointed at Carstairs and me. "Are they coppers?" "It's all right. I'm Dr. Watson. You saw me at Baker Street this morning, and this is Mr. Carstairs, who has a gallery in Albemarle Street." "What have you seen?" Holmes asked. Ross's manner changed. "I ain't seen nothing. He ain't come out. No one's gone in." Holmes looked quizzical, but he paid both boys, and they ran off together, Ross casting one last look in our direction. Inside the hotel, Holmes addressed the man in the office. "We're in pursuit of an American with a livid scar on one cheek. If you don't wish to land yourself in trouble with the law, you'll tell us where he can be found." The man directed us to a room at the end of the corridor. The gas jets were turned so low that we had almost to feel our way through the darkness. Holmes raised his fist, meaning to knock on the door, but then he stepped back. I looked down and saw a streak of liquid, almost black in the half-light, curling from beneath the door. Carstairs recoiled, his hands over his eyes. Without saying a word, Holmes brought his shoulder up against the door, and the flimsy lock shattered. And I saw at once that the crime which I'd once considered trivial had taken a turn for the worse. The window was open, the room was ransacked, and the man we'd been pursuing was curled up with a knife in the side of his neck. Inspector Lestrade took one look at the body. "It would seem we've been seeking the same man, Holmes. Is there any sign of the stolen necklace?" "I haven't yet had a chance to search the room." Lestrade looked around him. A cracked mirror hung on one wall. A washstand stood in a corner with a single misshapen lump of soap. The window looked over a narrow alley to a brick wall. He turned his attention to the dead man, who was dressed as Edmund Carstairs had first described him, in a frock coat, which was now saturated with blood. Lestrade searched his pockets, but found nothing. "Can we be sure this is the same man who has been watching Carstairs?" Holmes nodded. "Carstairs identified him." "He was here?" "Briefly." Holmes smiled to himself, and I recalled how we'd been compelled to bundle Carstairs into a cab after his fainting fit, and I'd understood how he must have been on board the Catalonia, following his experiences with the Flat Cap gang. Lestrade picked up a packet of cigarettes. "Old Judge. Manufactured in New York, I think you'll find. I found a similar stub outside Ridgeway Hall, and from the position of the body and the angle at which the knife was driven into his neck, it seems that the attacker was waiting for him beside the door. He walked in and was taken by surprise from behind." "A simple theft might still be the motive. There's no sign of the necklace or the £50. "I have every reason to believe you'll find the necklace in a pawnbroker on Bridge Lane. It certainly appears that whoever killed him took the money, but perhaps you should ask yourself what else was taken from the room. We have a body with no identity, Lestrade. You'd think that a visitor from America might have a passport?" Lestrade scowled. "Whatever name he chose when checking into the hotel, we know this is Keelan O'Donoghue, late of Boston. You see the scar on his face. O'Donoghue was injured at the same shootout in Boston when his twin brother was killed, and he came to England on a mission of revenge. It's as plain as a pikestaff." "To my eyes, it could hardly be less plain. Perhaps you could explain, Lestrade, who killed Keelan O'Donoghue?" "And why?" "Well, the most obvious suspect would be Edmund Carstairs, except that he was with Watson and I at the time of the murder. I might also ask why, if this really is Keelan O'Donoghue, he has a cigarette case marked with the initials WM. "What cigarette case?" "It's on the bed, partly covered by the sheet, which would doubtless explain why the killer missed it too." Lestrade examined the case. "The trouble with you, Holmes, is that you have a way of complicating things." The owner of the hotel, Mrs. Oldmore, had little to add when we questioned her on our way out. "He took the room for the week and paid me £1. An American gentleman just off a ship at Liverpool. He said there was someone he'd come to see in Wimbledon and asked how to get there. Someone who owes me something, and I mean to collect it, he claimed. From the way he talked, I could tell he was up to no good, but what can you do? If I turned away every suspicious-looking customer who came knocking at my door, I'd have no business at all." Lestrade left, and Holmes and I walked into the narrow alleyway that passed the room where the American had met his end. The window was halfway down, with a wooden crate set beneath it. The killer had clearly used it as a step. The alley came to a dead end. As we returned to the main road, Holmes was deep in thought. "You remember that boy, Ross, last night, Watson?" From where he was standing, he had a clear view of both the hotel and the alleyway. "But if Ross saw something, Holmes, why didn't he tell us?" "These boys live on their wits, Watson. If Ross thought there was money to be made, he'd take on the devil himself. But what could he possibly have seen? A figure? Caught in the gaslight? Flitting down a passageway?" "He looked afraid when we arrived," I said. "He mistook Carstairs for a police officer." "It was more than fear. I'd have said the boy was in the grip of something close to terror. But I assumed—" Holmes struck a hand against his brow. "We need to speak to him again. I hope I haven't been guilty of a grave miscalculation." Holmes sent word to Wiggins, but when his lieutenant reported back 24 hours later, it was with the worst possible news. Ross had disappeared. Holmes looked at Wiggins sternly. "Did Ross say anything to you after you left us at the hotel that night?" "There was a man, that was all. It put the wind up him. Ross had only come to London at the end of the summer, but normally he knows what's what. But he was shook to the core." "He saw the killer!" I exclaimed. "I don't know what he saw. He just said, 'I know him, and I can make something from him. More than the guinea I got from bloody Mr. Holmes. Forgive me, sir, but them were his exact words. I reckon he was going to put the squeeze on someone.'" Holmes looked as grave as I've ever seen him. "Think, boy. If he found himself in trouble, where might he go?" "Well, there was a charity what took him in. Chorley Grange, up Hamworth way. He told me he'd been there, but he hated it and ran away." 1 hour later, a cab dropped us off in front of 3 handsome buildings on a narrow lane on the way up to Hamworth Hill. The one at the centre resembled an English gentleman's country home. It was hard to believe we were so close to London, for the air was fresh and we were surrounded by farmland. The barns on either side had presumably been adapted to the school's needs. There was a 4th structure on the other side of the lane, surrounded by an ornate metal fence, but there was no movement there. We rang the front bell and were admitted by a sombrely dressed man in a grey suit, who listened in silence as Holmes explained our mission. He left us standing in an austere hall and disappeared down a long corridor. It struck me that the place was more like a monastery than a school. The man returned with another short, round-faced man who reminded me of the snowmen one might see in Regent's Park. His head one ball and his body another. He was bald and dressed in the manner of a clergyman. As he walked toward us, he beamed and spread his arms in welcome. "Mr. Holmes, you do us a great honour. The greatest consulting detective in the country here at Chorley Grange. And you must be Dr. Watson? We've read your stories in class. The boys won't believe you're here. But I'm running ahead of myself. I'm the Reverend Charles Fitzsimmons. Vosper tells me that you're looking for Ross. Please come to my study. You must meet my wife." Mrs. Fitzsimmons was reading a large tome in the dark, cheerless study. She couldn't have been more different from her husband, remarkably tall and dressed entirely in black. Were I a boy, I might have thought her a witch. The Reverend seemed to be searching his mind. "Ross? Ah, yes. We haven't seen him for quite a while, Mr. Holmes. He came to us from a very difficult background, as do many of the charges in our care." "He was a difficult and disagreeable child who wouldn't obey the rules and disrupted the other boys," his wife cut in. "You mustn't be too hard on him, dear. It is true, Mr. Holmes, that Ross was never grateful for the help we tried to give. He'd only been here a few months before he ran away. July, it must have been. I'm afraid we don't know where he's gone. We have 35 boys here, all taken from the streets. My wife and I are employed by the Society for the Improvement of London's Children. We give them food and shelter and, more important than either, a good Christian education. And you've no idea where Ross might have gone? No. His parents are dead. Ross was arrested for shoplifting, and the magistrate took pity and sent him to us. You could speak to his classmates, if you like. We left Mrs. Fitzsimmons in the study and followed the Reverend to a classroom. As we entered, 15 students stood up respectfully, gazing at us with pale, serious faces. Fitzsimmons announced, "This gentleman here is none other than Mr. Sherlock Holmes." This caused a tremor of recognition amongst the boys. "He's afraid that Ross might have got himself into a spot of trouble. Is there anyone in this room who knows anything that might help us find him?" A boy in the back row put up his hand. "Ross had a sister, sir. Her name's Sally. He said she worked at the Bag of Nails." For the first time, the Reverend looked angry, a dull red patch spreading into the round of his cheeks. "Why did you not tell me this before, Daniel? We could have found Ross sooner." "I'd forgotten, sir." Back in the hallway, Holmes said, "The school does you credit. It's remarkable how quiet and well-disciplined the boys seem to be." The Reverend Fitzsimmons had relaxed into his more congenial self. "I'm very grateful to you. Ross is the only one who's ever run away. When you find him, I hope you'll prevail upon him to return." He opened the front door and shook us by the hand. Holmes asked, "The building opposite, is it part of the school?" "Indeed so, Mr. Holmes. It was a coach builder's factory, but we've adapted it to our own needs, and now use it for public performances. I'd be honoured if you came to our next recital, Mr. Holmes." It was nearly dark by the time we reached the Bag of Nails pub. In answer to Holmes's query, the publican directed us round the back. "Sally's in the yard, but I doubt you'll get much from her. She's not the most talkative of girls." A pile of broken crates stood on one side of the courtyard. The ground was covered with smashed glass and twisted fragments of metal, and in the middle of it, barefoot and in a dress too thin for this weather, a girl of about 16 was sweeping what space was still available. "Sally Dixon?" Holmes asked. She clutched the broom handle as if it were a weapon. "What do you want?" "We don't wish you any harm. We want to speak to your brother, Ross." Her hands tightened. "Are you from the House of Silk? Ross isn't here. He's never been here. You can both go back where you came from. You make me sick." Holmes glanced at me, and hoping to be of service, I took a step toward the girl to reassure her. It was a grievous mistake. The girl seemed to punch the air in front of me, and I felt something white-hot slice across my chest. When I pressed my hand to the front of my coat, I saw blood trickling between my fingers. It took me a moment to realize that I'd been stabbed. Holmes rushed to my side. "My dear Watson!" Then the landlord appeared, and the girl let out a single guttural howl and fled. Although I was in pain, I knew that I hadn't been seriously injured. The thickness of my coat had protected me. Holmes turned to the landlord. "The girl was frightened, that's all. It was her brother we came here to find." "Well, you should have told me. Ross has been working here with Sally. but he's more trouble than he's worth. I don't know what he's up to, but he hurried out just before you arrived, said he had an appointment. I must see to my friend, Holmes said, but should either of them return, it's urgent that you send a message to my lodgings at 221B Baker Street. Come now, Watson, lean on me. The day's adventure ended with the two of us sitting by the fire. I with the restorative brandy, Holmes smoking furiously. I took a moment to reflect on the circumstances that had brought us to this point. It seemed to me that we'd strayed a great distance from our original quarry, the man with the flat cap, or, indeed, the identity of the person who'd killed him. Was this the person that Ross had seen outside the hotel? And if so, how could the boy possibly have recognized him? He must have told his sister something, for she'd been afraid on his behalf. It was almost as if she'd been expecting us. And then there were those words of hers. Are you from the House of Silk? The following morning, a police constable knocked at our door just after breakfast. Inspector Lestrade sends his compliments, sir. He's at Southwark Bridge and will be most grateful if you could join him. There's been a murder. A very nasty one. Lestrade was waiting for us on the bank, with a group of policemen who were clustered round what looked from a distance like a small heap of discarded rags. It was low tide, and the river seemed to have shrunk back, as if in distaste at what had happened here. "Is this the boy you were looking for?" Lestrade asked. Holmes nodded. Perhaps he didn't trust himself to speak. The boy had been beaten, brutally and methodically. Death, for Ross, would have been one long tunnel of pain. I found it beyond understanding that any human being could have done this to a 13-year-old boy. The inspector looked at Holmes. His pockets were empty. But there is something strange that you should see, though heaven knows what it signifies. It made me sickish, I tell you that much. Lestrade nodded, and one of the policemen knelt down and took hold of one small arm. The sleeve fell back to reveal a white ribbon, knotted around the boy's wrist. Looks as if it was placed on him after he was killed, as some sort of sign. "The House of Silk!" I exclaimed. "Do you know of it, Lestrade?" Holmes asked. "Never heard of it." "But I have." Holmes stared into the distance, his eyes filled with horror and self-reproach. In the cab on the way back, Holmes said, "I hold myself responsible. Honestly, Watson, there are times when I wonder if I shouldn't leave this profession and seek my fortunes elsewhere. A child is dead. You saw what they did to him. How am I to live with that? I was forewarned. I could have prevented it." We arrived in Baker Street, and Holmes plunged into the building, taking the stairs two at a time. As I arrived in our sitting room, I saw him seize hold of an envelope. "Here it is. It was hand-delivered." Holmes passed me the envelope. I opened it, and with a shiver I couldn't disguise, drew out a short length of white silk ribbon. "It arrived 7 weeks ago. I was involved in another case, and I set it aside and forgot it. Now, as you see, it's come back to haunt me." The next day we returned to the bag of nails to find that Sally hadn't returned. Holmes asked to see her room. There was a mattress on the floor. On it was a doll, which Sally must have rescued from some rubbish tip, and a blunt knife. Holmes crouched down and began to shuffle along the floor. It took me a moment to realize that he was following a trail of melted candle wax droplets. They led to the corner furthest from the bed. He pressed the blade of the knife between the wooden floorboards. One was loose, and he drew out a handkerchief of coins from beneath it. For two destitute children, the contents were a veritable treasure trove. The landlord scratched his head. When he came here, he said he could pay for the room, said he'd been given money by his uncle, but I didn't believe him." Holmes laughed. "Of course." He strode out of the pub and round the sweep of the Thames towards Bermondsey. "Come on, Watson. The pawnbrokers." Russell Johnson immediately assumed that the famous detective Sherlock Holmes had arrived in his establishment in pursuit of the stolen sapphire necklace, and announced that the police had taken it back. But Holmes was more interested in any items that Ross had brought to the shop. "Well, he brought in a gentleman's pocket watch a couple of months back." He rummaged in a cabinet and produced a watch on a chain set in a gold casing. Holmes paid for it, and we returned to Baker Street. The watch was a handsome piece manufactured in Geneva, and on the reverse there was an engraved image, a bird perching on a pair of crossed keys. "A family crest?" I suggested. "Watson, you're scintillating." And sure enough, Holmes's encyclopedia revealed it to be the crest of the Ravenshaws, one of the oldest families in the kingdom, with a manor house in Gloucestershire. Lord Ravenshaw had recently died, and his son, the Honourable Alec Ravenshaw, had inherited the title. To my dismay, Holmes insisted on leaving London at once. There was a carriage parked outside Ravenshaw Hall. To our amazement, Tobias Finch, Carstairs' partner at the picture gallery, came hurrying out of the house, climbed into the carriage, and rattled past us on the drive. A very singular coincidence, don't you think, Watson? A footman led us into a drawing-room of truly baronial proportions. Lord Ravenshaw was standing by a massive stone fireplace, which had the family crest carved into the lintel. My first impression was not entirely favourable. He had a ruddy, unattractive face, and his eyes protruded quite conspicuously. Even before we'd introduced ourselves, he seemed impatient. When Holmes returned the watch to him, for a moment Ravenshaw seemed uncertain it was even his. But as it dawned on him that he recognised it, he said, "It was given to me by my sister. I never thought I'd see it again." "I'd be interested to know how you lost it," Holmes said. "I can tell you exactly. I went to London in June for the opera. As I climbed out of my carriage, a young street urchin ran into me. I thought nothing of it at the time, but during the interval I looked to see the time and, of course, discovered that I'd been pickpocketed. I'm perfectly happy to pay for your travel expenses, Mr. Holmes, but other than that, I think I must wish you a good day." Holmes looked at him with equanimity. "I have just one last question, Lord Ravenshaw. Was I right in recognising an old friend of mine, Tobias Finch, as we arrived?" "Since you ask, yes, it was he. I don't enjoy discussing family business, Mr. Holmes, but you might as well know that my father had execrable taste in art, and it's my intention to rid myself of his collection. Carstairs and Finch is a most discreet gallery. And has Mr. Finch ever mentioned to you the House of Silk?" A silence followed Holmes's question, broken by the sharp snapping of a log in the fire. "You said one question, Mr. Holmes, and that is a second. I've had enough of your impertinence. Will you now leave?" As we stepped onto the path, Holmes chuckled. "Well, there's another mystery for you, Watson. If the watch was taken in June, Ross couldn't have been responsible, for he was at Chorley Grange. According to Jones, it was pawned a few weeks ago in October. So, what happened to it in the 4 months in between? If it was Ross who stole it, why did he hold on to it for so long?" We'd almost reached the gate when a black bird flew overhead, not a raven, but a crow. As I turned to watch it, I glanced back at the hall, and there was Lord Ravenshaw, standing at the window, watching us leave. His bulging eyes were fixed, and it seemed to me were filled with hatred. sighed with irritation. "We're going to have to call upon Mycroft." When I first heard that Holmes had a brother, it humanized him. Or at least it did until I met the brother. Mycroft was, in many ways, as peculiar as he. Unmarried, unconnected, existing in a small world of his own creation, largely defined by the Diogenes Club in Pall Mall. Holmes once admitted to me that his brother was a vital figure in government circles, a human repository of arcane facts, the man that every department consulted when something needed to be known. It was Holmes's opinion that, had he chosen to be a detective, he might have been his equal, or even, I was astonished to hear him admit, his superior. As he waddled into the stranger's room, he waved us to a sofa. "My dear Sherlock, I'm glad to see you, and you too, Watson, though I was sorry to hear of the death of the boy, Ross. You know I've advised you against the use of these street children, Sherlock. I hope you didn't place him in harm's way. And this business of the white ribbon, I find that most disturbing. It was clearly placed there as a warning." Holmes produced the hand-delivered envelope. "I was sent a piece of white ribbon 7 weeks ago. Have you heard of a place or an organisation called the House of Silk?" Mycroft shook his head. The name filled the girl who mentioned it to us with such fear that she struck out at Dr. Watson with a knife. "Goodness!" "I mentioned it also to Lord Ravenshaw." "The son of the former foreign minister?" "The very same. His reaction, I thought, was one of alarm, though he did his best not to show it." "Well, I can ask a few questions for you, Sherlock. Would it trouble you to call on me at the same time tomorrow?" In fact, we didn't have to wait 24 hours, for Mycroft arrived at Baker Street the following morning. This was a remarkable occurrence, for Mycroft had never visited us there before, and indeed never did again. He declined the offer of tea and handed the envelope back to his brother. "I'm returning this to you with some advice which I very much hope you'll take. I don't have any idea what the House of Silk is or where it may be found, but you must drop this investigation immediately." "You know I can't do that." "It did occur to me that if I tried to warn you, it would only make you turn this into a personal crusade, but I'm concerned that you're putting yourself into the gravest danger. Since our meeting yesterday, I have approached 1 or 2 people I know in certain government departments. At the time, I assumed that this House of Silk must refer to some sort of criminal conspiracy, and I only wished to discover if anyone in the police or the intelligence services was investigating it. The people I spoke to were unable to help. At least that's what they said. However, as I left my lodgings this morning, I was greeted by a carriage and taken to an office in Whitehall, where I met a man whom I cannot identify, but whose name will be known to you, and who works in close association with the Prime Minister himself. His manner was hostile, and he came straight to the point, asking me why I'd been asking about the House of Silk. I decided at once not to mention your name. Otherwise it might not be me who was now knocking at your door. Though my relationship with you is well known, and you may already be suspected. At any rate, I told him merely that one of my informers had mentioned it in relation to a murder in Burmany. He seemed to relax a little, although he continued to weigh his words with great caution. He told me that the House of Silk was indeed the subject of a police investigation. Things were at a delicate stage, and any intervention from an outside party could do untold damage. I don't think a single word of this was true, but I apologized for wasting his time and took my leave. The point is, Sherlock, that whatever the House of Silk is, it's a matter of national importance, and you have no idea of the damage you may do if you continue to be involved." Holmes reached for a cigarette. "But while I feel myself responsible for the death of the child, I owe it to him to do all I can to bring his killers to justice." Mycroft got to his feet. "I thought you might say that, Sherlock. And I suppose your words do you credit, but if you ignore my advice and go ahead with this investigation, and this leads you into peril, there will be nothing I can do to help you." Mycroft bowed slightly and left, followed shortly by Holmes, who claimed he had an errand to run. What the errand had been became clear with the arrival of the evening newspaper. There was an advertisement in the personal columns. £20 reward. Information relating to the House of Silk, to be treated in the strictest confidence. Apply 221B Baker Street. Holmes, you've done the very opposite of what Mycroft suggested. If you were going to pursue your investigation, you could at least have proceeded with discretion. It's time to seize the initiative, Watson. Mycroft inhabits a world of whispering men in darkened rooms. Well, let's see how they react to a little provocation. A few mornings later, Holmes' bait brought in a catch. Mrs. Hudson introduced a strange-looking man who called himself Henderson. He was built like a prize-fighter, and yet his hair was thin, his skin grey, and lips cracked. "Would you like some hot tea?" asked Holmes. "I prefer a tot of rum." Holmes nodded at me, and I poured a good measure into a glass. The man drained it at once. "The people that I deal with will cut my throat if they knew I was here. But I need the reward. I'd sell my mother for your £20, Mr. Holmes." "And what is the cause of your undoing, Mr. Henderson?" "Opium. I used to take it because I liked it. Now I can't live without it." I looked on the man with horror and pity. Holmes was also grave. "The place where you go to take this drug, is it the House of Silk?" "Do you know how many opium dens there are in Shadwell and Limehouse? The House of Silk is far bigger than that. Where do you think the opium comes from that supplies all these places? Where's the centre of the web? That's the answer to your question, Mr. Holmes. They go to the House of Silk. And I've heard it said, only rumour, mind, that it has friends in the very highest places." "And where is it to be found?" "I don't know exactly. I first heard it mentioned at Creer's place. A few weeks ago, one of his boys was late bringing in supplies. Creer had been drinking and was in an ill humour. He grabbed the boy and demanded, 'Where have you been?' 'The House of Silk,' the boy replied, and he handed over a packet. When Creer realised I'd heard everything, he pulled a gun on me and said, 'You ever repeat a word of that, and they'll be hauling your remains out of the Thames. Do you understand? If I don't kill you, they will.'" "Where's Creer's place to be found?" asked Holmes. "On the corner of Millwood Street. There's a red light burning in the doorway." When Henderson had left, Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eyes. "An opium den, and one that does business with the House of Silk. What do you think, Watson?" "I don't like the sound of it one bit, Holmes. I think you should stay well away." Holmes opened a drawer and took out a pistol. "Pshaw! I think I can look after myself." "Then I shall go with you." "My dear Watson, I cannot possibly allow it. In any event, the two of us together would look anything but the sort of customers who might be seeking out an East London opium den." "Then I'll remain outside. If you need assistance, a single shot will bring me to the scene." There was a fog that night as we walked down the alleyway near the Limehouse basin. The brick walls dripped with moisture, and all we could hear was the sound of our footsteps. But then the passage widened, and the whinny of a horse, the soft rumble of a steam engine, and the rippling of water echoed from different directions. A rat scuttled in front of us and slipped into the canal. We turned a corner, and a woman loomed in front of us, and I glimpsed a wrinkled face, hideously painted. There was the jangle of a piano, and finally, in front of us, I saw the lights of a public house. "We're here, Watson," Holmes whispered. "There's Millwood Street, and I imagine that to be Creer's place. You see the light?" "Holmes, I beg of you to let me accompany you." "No, it's better for one of us to remain outside. If it turns out that I'm expected, you'll be in a stronger position to come to my aid." "You think Henderson was lying?" "His story struck me as in every way improbable. But if it's a trap, we'll spring it and see where it takes us. We've touched something very deep, old friend, and we won't get to the bottom of it if we refuse to take risks. Wait here for an hour, and if I haven't reappeared, come after me, but take the greatest care. And if you hear gunfire, then come at once." It was with the gravest misgivings that I watched Holmes disappear into the fog. With nothing else to do, I pushed open the door of the bar and went in. I'll never forget the 50-minute vigil that I spent in that little room, with the out-of-tune piano and the silent men gazing into their glasses. At 10 to midnight, the still of the night was shattered by 2 gunshots and the sound of voices shouting in alarm. I was instantly across the street and into the entrance of Creer's place. The dry, burning smell of opium greeted my nostrils. I was in a gloomy room decorated in the Chinese style. 4 men lay stretched out on mattresses, with their Japan trays and opium lamps beside them. 3 were unconscious. The last gazed at me with unfocused eyes. 1 mattress was empty. A man, I assumed to be Creer, came running towards me. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Who?" I pushed past him down a corridor and through a door at the far end. As I forced it open, I felt the rush of cold air. I was at the back of the house. There was more shouting, the clatter of a horse and carriage, the blast of a police whistle. I knew already that we'd been tricked, but still had no idea what to expect. I ran down a narrow street, through an archway and into a courtyard. A small crowd had gathered. There was a man in evening dress, a police constable and 2 others, all staring in front of them. I pushed my way through, and never will I forget what I then saw. There were 2 figures. One was a young girl, whom I recognized at once, and with good cause, for she'd tried to kill me at the Bag of Nails only a few days before. It was Sally Dixon. She'd been shot in the chest and in the head, and was lying on the cobblestones in a pool of blood. I also knew the man who lay unconscious in front of her, one hand stretched out, still holding the gun that had shot her. It was Sherlock Holmes. Holmes looked dreadful. His skin was as white as paper, and although his eyes were open, he seemed unable to see clearly. He certainly didn't recognize me. A constable had arrived, and a tall, elegantly dressed, red-faced man was gesticulating with his stick. "I saw him shoot the girl with my own eyes, officer." "Who are you?" the constable demanded. "My name is Thomas Ackland. I was on my way home. I'm a doctor, and I can tell you at once that this man is under the influence of opium." Was he right? Holmes was certainly in the grip of some sort of narcotic, and given that he'd been in Creer's opium den for the past hour, it was absurd to suggest that anything else was responsible. And yet, when I looked closely at his eyes, they lacked the ugly pinpricks of light I'd have expected. I felt his pulse and found it sluggish, suggesting that he'd just been aroused from a deep sleep rather than involved in a shooting. Opium's effects might include euphoria and freedom from physical pain, but I'd never heard of a user being driven to acts of violence. And what possible motive could his muddled consciousness have come up with for killing the one girl he'd been most eager to find and protect. Finally, I doubted that Holmes would have been able to shoot with any accuracy. Had he been under the influence of the narcotic, he'd have had difficulty holding the gun steady. "Officer," I said, "my name is Dr. Watson, and this is Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective. However black and white the facts may appear, I assure you he's innocent of any crime." "There's no other explanation," Dr. Ackland interjected. "He came staggering round the corner, the girl was in the street begging, he took out a gun and he shot her." "He did it!" somebody shouted in the crowd, and this was followed by a murmur of assent from the ragged children in the front row. At that moment, the most reptilian man I have ever encountered emerged through the crowd. His eyes were too small for his face, and his skin was so smooth it was almost featureless. He questioned the constable, softly, but his voice had an edge that left you in no doubt that he was used to being obeyed. "Well, I rather doubt we'll be reading of this in one of your famous chronicles, will we, Dr. Watson? Unless it comes under the heading of The Adventure of the Psychotic Opium Addict. Your colleague was at Creer's place tonight?" "He was pursuing an investigation." "With a pipe and a needle, it would seem. Well, a pretty business we have here. Can you hear me, Mr. Holmes? My name is Inspector Harriman, and I'm arresting you for the murder of this young woman." Early the next morning, the one man I most wanted to see came striding in whilst I was having breakfast. My first thought was that he brought news that Holmes had already been released. But one look at Inspector Lestrade's face was enough to dash my hopes. "Frankly, this business beggars belief. Sherlock Holmes, for goodness sake! Have these people forgotten how much of a good turn we owe him at Scotland Yard? And yet it doesn't look good, Dr. Watson." "Where is Holmes?" I asked. "They held him overnight at Bow Street. As soon as I heard what had happened, I went straight round, but they wouldn't let me see him. This man Harriman's a queer one. Most of us at Scotland Yard muddle along together, but not him. He has no friends and no family that I know of. I saw him briefly this morning and asked to visit Mr. Holmes, and he just walked right past me. I've come here hoping you can shed some light on the matter." I had no choice but to acquaint Lestrade with everything that had happened, both before and after Ross had been killed, starting with our visit to Chorley Grange School, which had led us to his sister, Sally Dixon, at the Bag of Nails, and the discovery of the watch, our unhelpful interview with Lord Ravenshaw, Holmes's decision to put the advertisement in the evening papers, and the visit of the man who called himself Henderson, which led us to Creer's place. Looking back, I believe this was a deliberate trap to incriminate Holmes and to bring an end to his investigation, I said. Lestrade shook his head. "But what's this house of silk? And why would anyone go to such lengths to keep it secret? I have to tell you, Dr. Watson, it all seems a very long way from our starting point. A dead man in a hotel room who we think was Keelan O'Donoghue, a hoodlum and bank robber from Boston, in England to exact revenge on an art dealer for the death of his twin. How'd you get from there to the deaths of 2 children, and this business of the white ribbon?" That was exactly what Holmes was trying to discover. "Well, Inspector Harriman wants to try Mr. Holmes for murder." "I'll do what I can, Dr. Watson, but I think you should prepare yourself for the worst." Holmes was brought in to the Bow Street court, wearing the same clothes in which he'd been arrested. He'd clearly not slept. Gaunt at the best of times, he appeared positively emaciated, but as he was led into the dock, he turned and looked at me, and I saw a glint in his eye that told me that the fight wasn't over yet. Holmes was always at his most formidable when the odds seemed stacked against him. A barrister presented himself, a well-rounded, diminutive sort, and it soon became clear that he'd assumed the role of prosecutor, although a ringmaster might be the better description. "Even the best of men have their demons. And in the case of Mr. Holmes, it is opium, and that has turned him from a friend of the law into the basest malefactor." His first witness was Isaiah Creer. Yes, he said, the accused had entered his house, a private and legal establishment where gentlemen could indulge their habit in comfort and security. He had demanded a dose of the intoxicant, paid for it, and smoked it, and half an hour later he'd asked for a second. Mr. Creer was concerned that Mr. Holmes had become agitated, and suggested that a second dose might be unwise, but the gentleman had insisted. As Mr. Holmes smoked the second pipe, his sense of delirium had increased, to the extent that Creer had sent a boy out to find a policeman, fearing there might be a breach of the peace. Then, wild-eyed and beyond control, Mr. Holmes had insisted that there were enemies in the room, that his life was in danger. He'd produced a revolver, at which point Mr. Creer had insisted that he leave. "It's a rare side effect of the drug, but I've seen it happen before, Your Honour. I have no doubt that when Mr. Holmes gunned down that poor girl, he believed he was confronting some grotesque monster." Constable Perkins confirmed that he'd been approached by the boy Creer had sent, and was on his way to Millwood Street when he heard the gunshots. When he reached Coppergate Square, he discovered a man lying unconscious with a gun and a girl lying in a pool of blood. He was followed by Inspector Harriman, who didn't attempt to keep the contempt from his voice. "I'd been called to a break-in at a bank on the White Horse Road, and as I was leaving I heard gunshots and the constable's whistle, so I went to see if I could assist. But by the time I arrived, the Constable Perkins was in command, and doing an admirable task. That Mr. Holmes murdered Sally Dixon is beyond question. His subsequent protestations are no more than a cock and bull story. I have never encountered a case where the evidence has been more cut and dried." I almost expected him to take a bow. Instead, he nodded respectfully at the magistrate and sat down. The final witness was Dr. Thomas Ackland. In the light of day, he was an unattractive man with an unusually long neck and watery blue eyes. He'd been a professor of surgery at Edinburgh's Royal Hospital for Sick Children, but had moved to London after the death of his wife. He was a governor at the Westminster Hospital, which was established for the poor, and had himself given generously for the enlargement of the hospital. "I saw the whole thing. There was a girl, no more than 14 or 15 years old. I shudder to think what she might have been doing on the street at this hour, in such an area. When I first noticed her, her hands were raised, and she was quite clearly terrified. She uttered one word, 'Please.' Then there were 2 shots, and she fell to the ground. It was very dark, and I didn't see who fired the shots. Then I made out a figure, standing a short distance away, holding a gun, which was still smoking in his hand. As I watched, he groaned and fell to his knees, then sprawled, unconscious, on the ground. It was that man on the dock before you." There was a murmur in the court. This was the most damning evidence of all. Sitting next to me, Lestrade had become very still, and I confess I was in turmoil. I might be able to dismiss Creer, but it was absurd to suggest that an eminent Scottish doctor and a senior police officer should come together to fabricate a story and incriminate a man that neither of them had ever met. And yet, either all of them were lying, or Holmes, under the influence of opium, had indeed committed a terrible crime. The magistrate needed no such deliberation, and ruled that Holmes would have to remain in custody until the coroner's court the following week, and after that he would proceed to trial. As Holmes was led away, Lestrade said, "Move sharp, Dr. Watson, we don't have a lot of time." I followed him to the prisoner's waiting room, and Holmes appeared, escorted by a uniformed officer. My voice broke as I addressed him. "Holmes, I don't know what to say. The injustice of your arrest, the way you've been treated. It's certainly most interesting. It seems our friend Henderson led us a pretty song and dance, eh, Watson? I suspected we'd stumbled onto a conspiracy that went far beyond a murder in a hotel room. Now I'm certain of it. Let me tell you the true version of events. As I entered the opium den, Creer insisted that I follow him into his office to make payment. I was no sooner through the door than two men sprang on me, pinioning my arms. One of them was Henderson himself. The other had a shaven head and the shoulders and forearms of a wrestler. At the same time, Creer approached me carrying a small glass filled with some foul-smelling liquid, which he forced between my lips. The effect was almost immediate. The room span, and I remember nothing more until I awoke in Coppergate Square. Lestrade shook his head. "That's all very well, Mr. Holmes, but how do you explain the testimonies in court? They have colluded. Let's start with the good Dr. Ackland. Did you not find it surprising that although he said it was too dark for him to see who fired the shot, in the same breath he testified that he could see smoke rising from the gun? And then there's Harriman. You might find it worthwhile to confirm there really was a break-in at a bank on the White Horse Road. It seems a touch providential. If I were to rob a bank, I'd head for Mayfair or Belgravia, where the local residents might have deposited enough money to be worth stealing." Before Holmes could continue, Inspector Harriman appeared in the doorway, his face thunderous. "What the devil's going on here, Lestrade? This is my case. Officer, take this man to the House of Correction at Holloway, and tell them he will not be receiving visitors until my investigation is complete." There was nothing more that Lestrade or I could do. Mrs. Carstairs stood sobbing in front of me, while I simply stared at her like a fool. "Edmund doesn't know I've come. In fact, he counselled against it. But I swear I'll go mad, Dr. Watson. It's my sister-in-law, Eliza. She's been complaining of headaches for some time, but her condition has suddenly worsened. Now Edmund thinks she may be dying." "What made you think you might find help here?" I asked. Mrs. Carstairs wiped her eyes, and suddenly I saw the strength of spirit I'd noticed when we first met. "There's no love between my sister-in-law and I'll not pretend otherwise. From the very start she thought me an adventuress out to ensnare her brother. Forget the fact that I came to this country with plenty of money of my own. Forget that I was the one who nursed Edmund back to health and bought the Catalonia. She and her mother would have hated me no matter who I was. Edmund had always belonged to them, you see. Eliza even blames me for the death of her mother. The flame that blew out on her gas fire became in her mind a deliberate suicide, as if the old lady preferred to die than to see me as the new mistress of the house. In a way, they're both mad." "And this new illness?" "Eliza thinks she's being poisoned and insists that I'm responsible. She accused me in front of Edmund. She's sick, there's no doubting that. And Edmund takes the view that her delusions are part of the sickness. Even so, the situation has become intolerable for me. All her food is now prepared separately in the kitchen by Mrs. Kirby and carried straight up to her room by Mr. Kirby. Edmund actually shares it with her, like one of those ancient Roman food tasters. Maybe I should be grateful. For a week now, he's eaten everything that she's eaten, and he's in perfect health. While she becomes sicker and sicker. The doctors are baffled. First they thought it was blood poisoning. Now they're treating her for cholera." Catherine Carstairs lowered her head, and when she raised it again, her eyes were full of tears. "I'll tell you a terrible thing, Dr. Watson. Part of me wants her to die. At least then Edmund and I would be left in peace. She seems intent on tearing us apart." "Would you like me to come with you to Wimbledon?" I asked. Her eyes brightened. "Would you?" Edmund Carstairs was not pleased to see me in the hallway of his home. He turned to his wife. "I thought we agreed that we wouldn't be resorting to the services of Sherlock Holmes, who, I was just reading in the paper, has fallen into the most disreputable circumstances." "He did so in pursuit of the business you brought to his door," I stated. "Come, Edmund. Dr. Watson has very kindly travelled with me from London. He's agreed to see Eliza and give us the benefit of his opinion." "Eliza has already been seen by several doctors." Mrs. Carstairs took her husband's arm. "And one more can't hurt. Please, my dear." Carstairs patted her hand. "Very well. Dr. Watson, forgive my rudeness. I'm glad to see you. It's just that this nightmare never seems to stop." Carstairs led me up to his sister's bedroom. The curtains were partly drawn, and there was a fire burning in the grate. I noticed a second door, opened into an adjoining bathroom, and the smell of lavender bath salts was heavy in the air. Eliza was lying propped up with pillows. I could see at once that her health had deteriorated rapidly since my last visit. Her eyes stared pitifully over the sharp ridges that her cheekbones had become. "Dr. Watson, why have you come?" "Your sister-in-law asked me, Miss Carstairs." "My sister-in-law wants me dead." "That's not the impression she gave me. May I take your pulse?" "You may take what you wish. I have nothing more to give. And when I'm gone, take my word for it, Edmund will be next." Her pulse was beating much too rapidly. "You have abdominal pain?" I asked. "Yes. And aching joints?" "I can feel my bones rotting away." "You might open the windows to allow the air to circulate. And cleanliness, of course, is of the first importance." "I bath every day." The sick woman fell back, closing her eyes. "Thank you for your visit, Dr. Watson. Open the windows, keep clean. I can see you must be at the very pinnacle of your profession." A cab dropped me back at Baker Street. As I walked to the front door I knew so well, I found my path blocked by a short, solid man in a black coat. "Dr. Watson, I wonder if I might ask you to come with me?" "On what business?" "On a matter that relates to your friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "And what information do you have that you cannot tell me here?" "I have no information, Dr. Watson. I'm merely the agent of one who does. The gentleman for whom I work is not inviting your presence, he's demanding it. It would be a horrible mistake to deny him. Could I ask you to look down, sir? Don't start. You're quite safe, I assure you. Now, if you'd be kind enough to come with me." I'd stepped back in astonishment, for on doing as he'd asked, I'd seen that he was holding a revolver aimed at my stomach. He gestured to a four-wheel carriage with windows of frosted glass. The interior was empty, the fittings elegant, the walls lined with silk, not white, but pearl grey. The man followed me in and closed the door. At once the horses were whipped and we set off. All I could see through the opaque glass was the passing glow of gas lamps, and even those fell away once we left the city. A blanket had been placed on the seat for me, and I drew it over my knees, for, like every other December night, it had become very cold. The journey lasted 2 interminable hours, but there was nothing to tell me in which direction we were going, nor how far. We might well have been going round and round in circles. At one point I heard a steam train passing above us. Otherwise, I felt swallowed by the darkness. Finally we came to a shuddering halt, and my travelling companion opened the door. "We'll go straight into the house, Dr. Watson." I glimpsed only a massive, uninviting house, the front draped in ivy, the garden overrun with weeds and surrounded by high walls. I was led down a gloomy corridor and into a library where a log fire burned in a stone fireplace. Bookshelves rose from floor to ceiling. Whoever owned the house must be well versed in French, German, and Italian. But there was no fiction on the shelves. His interests encompassed physics, philosophy, history, and mathematics, books that put me very much in mind of Sherlock Holmes. A door opened on the far side of the room to reveal a man so tall and thin that he seemed out of proportion to the door frame. He was wearing a velvet smoking jacket and Turkish slippers. Behind him I could see a chemical laboratory with test tubes, carboys, and hissing Bunsen lamps. "Dr. Watson, has Underwood offered you wine? I trust he looked after you on the journey?" "He didn't even tell me his name." "That's hardly surprising. I don't intend to tell you mine. But we have business to attend to. I hope you'll dine with me." "It's not my habit to take dinner with men who refuse even to introduce themselves." "Perhaps not. But I'd ask you to consider this. Anything could happen to you in this house. Nobody saw you come. If you were never to leave, the world would be none the wiser. So I'd suggest that of the options open to you, a pleasant dinner with me may be one of the more preferable. Please come this way." He led me to a dining room that must have occupied an entire wing of the house, with a minstrel's gallery at one end and a refectory table with room enough for 30 people. My host sat at the head of the table. "I have often wanted to meet you, Dr. Watson. I'm a great admirer of you and your chronicles. I've just finished The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. I was most gripped by your depiction of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and his methods. Some wine? It's a shame Holmes doesn't devote himself exclusively to this sort of domestic crime, where the motives are negligible and the victims of no account. It's when your friend turns his attention to larger matters, business enterprises, organized by people such as myself, that he becomes an annoyance. I rather fear that recently he's done precisely that. I'm a mathematician, Dr. Watson. My work is studied in most of the universities of Europe. I am also what you would doubtless term a criminal, although I'd like to think I've made a science out of crime. You might say I'm an abstract thinker. I orchestrate, others perform." "And what do you want with me?" "I wish to help you. Or, more to the point, I wish to help Sherlock Holmes. It was a great pity he didn't pay attention to me 2 months ago, when I sent him a certain keepsake, inviting him to look into the business which has now caused him such grief." "The length of white ribbon! You are part of the House of Silk!" For the first time the man looked angry. "I have nothing to do with it." "But you know what it is." "Any act of wickedness that takes place in this country is brought to my attention, Dr. Watson. I have admitted that I'm a criminal, by which I mean that there are certain rules governing society which I find a hindrance and so choose to ignore. But I'm not an animal, Dr. Watson. I do not murder children. And there are other rules which are, to my mind, inviolable. But what right have I to judge my fellow criminals? I would certainly not expect to be judged by them." "So you sent Holmes a clue?" "I acted on impulse, which is unusual for me, and shows how annoyed I'd become. I can't tell you how sorry I was that Holmes chose to ignore me. It is my sincere belief that the world would be a much better place without the House of Silk." "What is the House of Silk? Where can I find it?" "I only wish that I could tell you, but I'm afraid Holmes must discover for himself. And, Dr. Watson, you must swear never to tell Holmes or anyone else about this meeting." "And if I refuse?" He slid a small metal key across the table towards me. The key to Holmes's cell. I almost laughed. You want me to help Holmes break out of Holloway? There's no alternative. You have no conception of the people you're up against. Let me make it clear to you. Holmes's life is in great danger. His enemies won't allow matters to come to court. They plan to kill him while he's in jail. Trust me, the order has already been given. With the key to Holmes's cell concealed in the spine of a leather-bound book, I knocked on a door beside the outer gate of the prison. It was opened by a surprisingly jovial officer who had a bunch of keys hanging from a wide leather belt. "Come in, sir. It's more pleasant in than out, and there's not many days you can say that." I watched him lock the door behind us, then followed him across a courtyard to a second gate, smaller, but no less secure than the first. We entered a corridor with an open door to one side, and it was through here that I was taken to meet the chief warder. "Oh, Dr. Watson, my name's Hawkins. You've come to see Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" "Yes. I'm sorry to have to inform you that he was taken ill this morning. I can assure you that we've done everything we can to accommodate him in a manner appropriate to a man of his distinction, despite the very serious crimes of which he's accused." "What's wrong with him?" "We have no idea. He took his lunch at 11 o'clock and rang the bell for assistance immediately after. My officers found him doubled up on the floor of his cell." I felt an ice-cold tremor in the very depth of my heart. "Where is he now?" "In the infirmary. Our medical officer, Dr. Trevelyan, has a number of private rooms which he reserves for desperate cases. He insisted on moving Mr. Holmes there. I'm a medical man myself. I must see him at once." But before we could leave, a man that I knew all too well appeared, blocking our way. If Inspector Harriman had been told the news, he didn't look surprised by it. "So, what's all this about, Hawkins? Sherlock Holmes ill?" "Seriously ill, sir. We're just on our way to see him." "Then I will accompany you." The three of us set off through the depths of the prison. We had reached the end of the central block and passed through an archway into one of the wings. By now I had no idea where I was, and would never have been able to find my way out again. I thought of the key I was carrying. Holmes would have needed a dozen keys and a map to get out of this place. There was a pair of glass-panelled doors ahead of us. Once again, these had to be unlocked. They swung open into a bare, clean room. There were 8 beds, facing each other in 2 rows of 4. Only 2 were occupied. One by a shriveled, bald man whose eyes were already focusing on the next world. A hunched-up shape, too small to be Holmes, lay shivering in the other. A man in a frock coat came over to greet us. From the first I thought I recognized him. Just as it occurred to me now, his name had also been familiar. He addressed the chief warder. "I have nothing further to report, sir, except that I fear the worst." "This is Dr. Watson," Hawkins said. He shook my hand. "Dr. Trevelyan, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, although I'd have asked for happier circumstances." I was certain I knew him, but by the way he'd spoken and the firmness of his handshake, he was making it clear that even if we weren't meeting for the first time, this was the impression he wished to give. "It is food poisoning?" Harriman demanded. "I'm positive that poison of one sort or another is responsible," Trevelyan replied. "As to how it came to be administered, it is not for me to say, though all the prisoners in the wing eat the same food, and only he has become ill." "Well, I don't believe a word of it," Where is Mr. Holmes?" Trevelyan called out to a lanky fellow who was sweeping the floor. "Rivers, the key!" Rivers lumbered over to the desk, took up a keychain and carried it to a door on the far side of the room. He was sullen and rough-looking, with unruly ginger hair spilling down to his shoulders. "Rivers is my orderly," Trevelyan explained. "He's a good man, but simple." The orderly turned the key and drew back 2 bolts on the back of the door, which opened to reveal a small monastic room with plain walls, a square window, a bed, and a privy. The bed was empty. Harriman plunged inside. He tore off the covers. He knelt down and looked under the bed. "Is this some sort of trick? Where is he?" There could be no doubting it. Sherlock Holmes had disappeared. Harriman rose to his feet and almost fell upon Dr. Trevelyan. "What's going on?" "I have no idea. He had a high fever. His eyes were dilated and the sweat was pouring from his brow. He couldn't possibly have walked out of here. And look at the door. For heaven's sake, it was locked and bolted from the outside. And even if by some inexplicable means he's been able to leave the cell, where do you think he'd go? There must be a dozen more locks and bolts between here and the front gate." "Nobody can leave this place," Rivers smirked, "unless his name's Wood. Now, he left here only this afternoon. Not on his own 2 legs, though." "Who's Wood?" Harriman demanded. Dr. Trevelyan scowled at Rivers. "Jonathan Wood died last night, and you're wrong to make light of it, Rivers. He was carried out in a coffin not an hour ago." "Are you telling me that a closed coffin was taken from this room?" Harriman turned on the orderly. "Did you go into Holmes? Leave him on his own, even for a second?" I took a glass of water in. He was sound asleep. Then Collins here had a coughing fit, so I put the mug down and ran out to him." "Did you see Holmes again?" "No, sir. I settled Collins, then I went back and locked the door." We all stood, staring at each other. Then Harriman spoke. "Where's the coffin now?" "There'll be a wagon outside waiting to take it to the undertaker's," said Trevelyan. I will never forget the progress that we made through the prison. Hawkins went first, with a furious Harriman at his side. Trevelyan and Rivers came next. I followed last. As we passed through the outer gate, we found ourselves in a broad avenue. A wagon stood waiting, while 2 men loaded a makeshift coffin into the back. Harriman let out a cry. "Hold there! Lower the coffin back to the ground." The men glanced at each other quizzically before they obeyed. "Open it." The men hesitated, but Trevelyan nodded. "It's all right." At that very moment, I realized where we'd met before. He had come to Baker Street 6 or 7 years before, in need of Holmes's services. Circumstances hadn't been kind to the doctor then, and had clearly become worse since, for he'd aged considerably. Nevertheless, it was certainly the man that Holmes had helped, and it occurred to me, with a sense of excitement, that he must have colluded in this attempted escape. Why else would he have pretended not to know me? The pity of it was that the 2 labourers had been so slow. I watched as one of them placed a crowbar under the lid of the coffin. The wood splintered, and as one, Harriman, Hawkins, Trevelyan, and I moved closer. "That's him," Rivers grunted. "That's Jonathan Wood." Harriman stared at the corpse. "But where's Sherlock Holmes?" "He can't have left the prison," Hawkins replied. "He must still be inside, waiting his opportunity." Harriman spun on his heel. "We must raise the alarm. The man must be found." He wasn't. 2 days later, I was alone in Holmes's lodgings, reading a report of his disappearance, when Mrs. Hudson ushered in the Reverend Fitzsimmons of Chorley Grange School. You'll forgive me interrupting you, Dr. Watson. I was unsure whether to come, but first, this extraordinary business with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Is it true? It is true that Holmes is suspected of a crime of which he's completely innocent. But I read that he's escaped. Do you know where he is? I've no idea. And the child, Ross, do you have any news of him? Evidently, Fitzsimmons had somehow missed the reports of the boy's terrible death. I had the unenviable task of telling him. The headmaster fell heavily into a chair. Dear God in heaven! Who would do such a thing to a child? Well, my visit to you is redundant, Dr. Watson. I thought I might be able to help you find him. My wife found this when she was turning his mattress. Fitzsimmons took out a thin exercise book. Written on the cover in a childish hand was the name Ross Dixon. He opened the book in the middle to show a sheet of paper neatly folded and slipped inside. It was a cheap flyer for an attraction of the sort that had sprung up around Islington and Cheapside. Dr. Silkin's House of Wonders. Midgets, jugglers, the fat lady and the living skeleton. 1 penny entrance. Jackdaw Lane, Whitechapel. Fitzsimmons collected his things and got to his feet. I felt sure it was worthy of investigation. Thank you for your time, Dr. Watson. I am very shocked about young Ross. After he'd left, I read over the gaudy lettering 2 or 3 times before I saw what should have been obvious to me from the start. Dr. Silkin's House of Wonders. I had just found the House of Silk. I didn't have time to reflect any further, as my wife was due back in London, and I had to meet her train. The station was crowded with young men carrying packages and hampers, scurrying around as excitably as Alice's white rabbit. Mary's train had already arrived, and I saw her as she climbed down from the carriage. A man shuffled across the platform as if about to accost her. I could only see him from the back, and apart from an ill-fitting jacket and red hair, would have been unable to identify him again. He seemed to speak briefly to her, then boarded the train. Then she saw me and smiled, and I took her in my arms. "Did you see that man just now?" she asked. "Did he speak to you?" "He addressed me by name, and he pressed this into my hand." She produced a small cloth bag. There was something heavy inside it. I heard the clink of metal, and thought at first that it might be coins. But on pouring the contents into the palm of my hand, I found myself holding 3 solid nails. "Why on earth would anyone give you a bag of nails?" The words were no sooner out of my mouth than I understood and let out a cry of exultation. "The bag of nails! Of course! I believe, Mary, that you may have just met Holmes himself." There was one man sitting in the saloon bar of the Bag of Nails, and it was not Sherlock Holmes. To my great surprise, and somewhat to my mortification, I recognized Dr. Trevelyan's orderly, Rivers. "Sit down, Watson. It's very good to see you." It was Holmes who spoke, and in that second I understood how I'd been deceived, and how, with Dr. Trevelyan's help, Holmes had hoodwinked Inspector Harriman into leading him out of Holloway Prison. A man in a frock coat, with a pointed nose, and the bright eyes of a pantomime Mephistopheles, imposed himself on us. "1 penny entrance, Dr. Silkin's House of Wonders. It will astonish you. It will amaze you." "You are Dr. Silkin?" Holmes asked. "I have that honour, sir." We paid our pennies and passed into a cobbled yard. Some of the entranceways had been hung with crimson curtains, and signs advertising the man with no neck, the 5-legged pig. A shooting gallery had been set up inside one of the buildings, and I could hear the crack of rifles. There were also gypsy wagons with platforms between them for performances, and all around a crowd, far larger than I'd expected, laughed and applauded. "Do you still believe this to be the House of Silk?" asked Holmes. "Are you telling me you don't think it is? I knew from the outset there was no possibility." For once I couldn't hide my irritation. "Then perhaps you can tell me why we're here?" "Because we were invited, Watson. You were meant to give that flyer to me." At that very moment my breath caught in my throat. There was a fortune-teller sitting on a raised platform. As I caught her eye, she raised a hand in salutation. And there it was, tied around her wrist, a length of white silk ribbon. I climbed the steps. "I'd like to have my fortune told." She took my hand. "A doctor, and married. Happily, no children. Have you come here alone?" "I'm with a friend." "Then I have a message for you. You will discover the answers you seek in the rooms above the shooting range. But tread carefully, Doctor. The building's condemned and the floor's lousy." I climbed back down to Holmes. "So, now we're to be guided by fortune-tellers. Well, Watson, we must see this through to the end." The shooting gallery had a staircase twisting unevenly above. On the upper floor, the dust was thick on every surface. The light from the torches, which blazed around the fair outside, cast distorted shadows. "Watson," Holmes muttered, and the tone of his voice was enough to tell me what he desired. I produced my gun. In the far corner, a spindle top and a lead soldier lay abandoned on the floor. There was something infinitely pathetic about them. Had they belonged to Ross? I moved towards them, just as had been intended, for too late did I see the man step out from behind an alcove and strike me on the arm with a cudgel. I felt a blaze of pain, and my gun clattered to the floor. "Don't either of you move, or I'll shoot you where you stand." The man who'd lured Holmes into the trap at Creer's opium den emerged from the shadows. He was holding a revolver, and the man with the cudgel picked up my gun. "Good evening, Henderson," Holmes remarked. "You aren't surprised to see me, Mr. Holmes?" "On the contrary, I'd fully expected it." "And you remember my friend, Bratby?" Holmes turned to me. "This was the man who held me down while the opiate was forced on me." Henderson laughed. "Well, you didn't find what you were looking for at Creer's, and you haven't found it here either. However, you did well to escape from Holloway Prison. This time our methods are going to be a little more direct. I've been instructed to shoot you like a dog." "In that event, would you be so kind as to satisfy my curiosity? Was it you who killed the girl in Coppergate Square?" "It was." "And her brother, Ross?" "Yes." "Can we get this over?" Bratby urged. "Not yet, Jason." For once, I didn't need Holmes to explain why they were waiting. For the moment, the shooting alley was silent. The two assassins were waiting for the rifles to recommence, to mask two further gunshots up here. "You might as well put down your weapons and give yourselves up," Holmes remarked. "There's going to be no killing tonight. The fair's over." For the first time I realized that the barrel organ had stopped. The crowd seemed to have departed. "Put those guns down!" a voice cried out. Henderson swung his gun round. There was a fusillade of shots, and he was literally thrown off his feet, blood pouring from his head. Bratby spun round, and a bullet hit him in the chest. "You left that very late, Lestrade," said Holmes. "I was interested to hear what the villain said." I looked round. and saw that Inspector Lestrade was indeed here, and 3 police officers with him. Holmes turned his attention to me. "How's the arm, Watson?" "Nothing that a little embrocation and a whisky and soda won't cure. But tell me, Holmes, you knew all along that this was a trap?" "It seemed inconceivable that an illiterate child would keep an advertisement folded under his mattress." "But the name, Dr. Silkin's House of Wonders. My dear Watson, Silkin isn't so uncommon a name. They could just as easily have used Silkin the timber yard in Battersea." Holmes picked up my gun and handed it to me. "Will you accompany me a little further, Watson? And you, Lestrade?" We returned to Chorley Grange School for Boys. Where else could the investigation have taken us? Somebody had left the flyer for the headmaster to find. Lestrade brought 10 men with him, in 4 separate carriages that followed each other silently. We stopped a short distance from our target, which was not the school itself, but the square building on the other side of the lane. Fitzsimmons had told us that it was used for musical recitals, and in this at least he must have been telling the truth, for there were several coaches parked outside, and I could hear piano music coming from within. It was 8:30, and it had begun to snow, as we took our position behind a clump of trees. I heard the soft rattle of an approaching carriage, a brougham pulled by a couple of fine grey mares. I glanced at Holmes. There was a look of cold satisfaction in his face. "Do you see, Watson?" In the moonlight, I saw a raven and 2 keys painted in gold on the side of the brougham. It was the family crest of Lord Ravenshaw, the arrogant man whose stolen watch we'd restored to him. The coach turned into the driveway, and Lord Ravenshaw descended. He walked to the front door, and as the light spilled out, I saw something dangling from his hand. It was a white silk ribbon. He was admitted. "Exactly as I thought," Holmes said. "Watson, your gun's loaded. A single shot, Lestrade. That'll be the signal for you and your men to come in." We crossed the road, and Holmes knocked on the door. It was opened by a young man I hadn't seen before. "Dr. Ackland recommended you to me," said Holmes, using the name of his accuser in court. "And did he provide you with any token?" Holmes produced a length of white silk ribbon. The effect was immediate. "Come in." The steward led us through an opulent hallway. Gas lamps in ornate holders poured light onto elaborate rococo mirrors. We were shown into a conservatory filled with ferns. "If you'll wait here, gentlemen, I'll inform the master of the house." As he disappeared, I said, "For heaven's sake, what is this place?" Holmes looked at me grimly. "The House of Silk. It's been in front of us all the time, Watson. Do you remember the charity Fitzsimmons told us he was working for? The Society for the Improvement of London's Children. SILC. Somewhere, far above us, I heard someone cry out, and my blood froze, for I was sure it was the sound of a child. We slipped out into the corridor and up a staircase. There was an odour in the air that was sweet and unpleasant. Even though the truth had still not fully dawned on me, my every instinct was to leave this place. Holmes opened the door closest to him, and together we looked in. At the candles, the mirror, the bearded man we'd never seen before, sitting, dressed only in a white shirt, at the boy on the bed behind him. I didn't want to believe it, but nor could I disavow the evidence of my own eyes, for that was the secret of the House of Silk. It was a house of ill repute, one designed for men with a gross perversion and the wealth to indulge it. Their wretched victims have been drawn from those same schoolchildren I'd seen at the austere school across the road, plucked up the London streets, with no families or friends to care for them. Ross had briefly been one of them. No wonder he'd run away. What sort of country did I live in, I wonder, that could so utterly abandon its young? "What the devil do you think you're doing?" thundered the man. Holmes closed the door, and at that very moment I heard Fitzsimmons cry out as he entered the conservatory and found that we'd gone. A door opened further down the corridor, and a man stepped out, his clothes in disarray. It was Inspector Harriman. Without a second thought, I took out my revolver and fired the single shot that would bring Lestrade and his men rushing to our aid. More doors flew open, and middle-aged men lurched into the corridor, their faces filled with panic, as Lestrade and his men appeared on the scene. Holmes was already chasing down the staircase after Harriman, and I followed. We plunged into the snow just in time to hear the crack of a whip as a four-wheeled curricle, drawn by two horses, raced towards the gate. Holmes leapt into the nearest vehicle, a flimsy dog-cart, and somehow I managed to clamber into the back. We might have had one horse less than Harriman, but our vehicle was lighter and more agile, and the little dog-cart simply flew over the snow. Holmes held the reins with both hands, keeping his balance with his feet. Every pothole threatened to throw him as we careered down the hill. Harriman was no more than 40 yards ahead. Somehow we were managing to close the gap between us. The lane veered round to the left. If we tried to take it at this speed, we'd surely be killed. Holmes dragged on the reins, and the dog-cart sluiced across the surface, ice and mud spitting out from beneath the wheels. There was a sharp crack ahead. The curricle had taken the corner too quickly. As I watched, Harriman was jerked out of his seat into the air. For a brief second he was suspended there. Then the curricle toppled onto its side, and he disappeared from sight. Holmes guided our horse to a halt. "Well, Watson, do you think I have a future as a cab driver?" "I wouldn't expect too many tips." As we climbed down, one glance told us that the pursuit was over. Harriman was covered in blood, his neck badly broken, his eyes staring at the sky. When we arrived at Ridgeway Hall, Holmes was unperturbed by our frosty reception. "Mr. Carstairs, you came to me because you were being terrorized by a man in a flat cap, a man you believed to be Keelan O'Donoghue from Boston. I can tell you that I am now in command of the facts, which I am happy to share with you. I can also tell you who killed the man at Mrs. Oldmore's hotel. You may try to persuade yourself that these things are no longer important, but let me put it very simply. If you wish to save your sister, you'll hear what I have to say." I could see Carstairs fighting with himself. In some strange way he seemed almost afraid of us, but in the end his better sense prevailed. "Please," he gestured to the drawing-room, but Holmes said, "If you'll permit me, I'd like to see your sister first." I was dismayed by the sight of Eliza Carstairs. Holmes examined her briefly, then went into her bathroom. When he reappeared, he said, "We can return downstairs." Bemused, we followed him to the drawing-room, where Catherine Carstairs was no more pleased to see us than her husband had been. Holmes took the seat furthest from the fire. "When you first came to my lodgings, Mr. Carstairs, there were many aspects of your story that I found remarkable, the principal one being the behaviour of this vigilante, Keelan O'Donoghue, if indeed it was he. I could well believe that he'd followed you to London with the express purpose of killing you. You had, after all, encouraged Cornelius Stillman to hire the Pinkerton's agents, who tracked down the flat-cap gang and killed his twin brother. Remind me, what was the name of the chief investigator? Bill McParland. Of course. What puzzled me was why, when Keelan discovered where you lived, did he not kill you? Nobody knew he was in the country. He could have been on a ship back to America before you were even in the morgue. But he stood outside your house, wearing the flat cap he knew would identify him. He wished to frighten us, Mrs. Carstairs said. But on his next visit, he pressed a note into your husband's hand, asking for a meeting at the church. A meeting to which he didn't show up, Carstairs said. His final intervention in your life came when he broke into the house and stole £50 in jewellery from your safe. By now, I'm finding his behaviour more than remarkable. Not only does he know exactly which window to choose, he somehow got his hands on a key, lost by your wife several months before he arrived in the country. And it's interesting, is it not, that he's now more interested in money than murder? He could have climbed the stairs and killed you both in bed. But I woke up and heard him. Indeed, Mrs. Carstairs. I take it that you and Mr. Carstairs sleep in separate rooms. Carstairs flushed. Our domestic arrangements have no bearing on the case. You don't deny it? Very well. Our intruder makes his getaway to a private hotel in Burmany, where a second assailant stabs him to death and takes not only his money, but anything that might identify him, apart from a cigarette case, which bears the initials WM. Now, it may help if we put ourselves in the position of this mysterious visitor. He seeks a private interview with a member of this household. To begin with, he watches from a distance. But finally he approaches with a note written in large letters. Is it possible, perhaps, that he intended simply to hold it up so that it could be read through the window? Unfortunately, however, Mr. Carstairs returned unexpectedly early to the house, so the visitor hands the note to him, knowing he's being watched from the breakfast room. His meaning is now rather different. Find me, or I'll tell everything I know. Of course he doesn't turn up at the church. The warning was enough. But who did he wish to speak with, if not with me? Who was in the breakfast room at the time? Carstairs frowned. My wife. Anyway, who was this man if it wasn't Keelan O'Donoghue? The answer is perfectly simple, Mr. Carstairs. He was Bill. Or William McParland. Consider, we know McParland was injured during the shootout in Boston. Your man had a recent scar on his right cheek. We also know he'd fallen out with Cornelius Stillman, who'd refused to pay him the amount of money he believed he was owed. Now, let's consider the fate of Keelan O'Donoghue. You told us that Rourke and Keelan were twins, but that Keelan was the smaller of the two. He wore a flat cap, which would have made it difficult to see his face. You also told me that the gang all lived together in the tenement in Boston, but only Keelan had the luxury of his own room. I wondered from the start why that might be. The answer, of course, is quite obvious. Keelan O'Donoghue is a girl. Carstairs looked at Holmes in wonderment. And where is this girl? You're married to her, Mr. Carstairs. Catherine Carstairs turned pale. I've never heard anything quite so preposterous. You're not going to allow him to speak to me this way, are you, Edmund? But Carstairs was gazing in front of himself with an expression of horror. Please, Edmund! She reached out to him, but he flinched. It was as if a silken veil had been torn from Catherine Carstairs' face. Suddenly she was glaring at us with an expression of hatred. Holmes was unmoved. How amusing it must have been for you. to come to his aid on the ship back from Boston, to befriend him and draw him into your net. You played the part of the devoted wife, and your charade was made easier by the fact that you sleep in separate rooms. I fancy you've never allowed yourself to be seen in a state of undress. There was the inconvenience of that tattoo, was there not? The tattoo containing the initials of your twin brother. All would have been well but for the arrival of Bill McParland. He tracked you from Boston, and he demanded the money he felt entitled to. If you paid him, he'd let you keep your secret. You opened the window and allowed him to climb in. You opened the safe with a key which you'd never in fact lost, and you gave him the necklace which belonged to the late Mrs. Carstairs, and which you knew had great sentimental value to your husband, out of malice. But McParland made a mistake. The £50 you gave him was only a first payment. Foolishly, he gave you the name of the hotel where he was staying. While your husband was at his gallery, you went to Burmany and climbed into the hotel through a back window. You were waiting in McParland's room when he returned, and took him unawares. With McParland dead, there was nothing to stand in the way of the rest of your scheme. It was your intention to kill Edmund's family, one at a time, his mother, his sister, and then he. "My mother?" Carstairs gasped. Holmes nodded. Your wife deliberately blew out the flame of her gas fire, leaving the old lady to perish. And Eliza? Your sister uses strong lavender bath salts. I would say that a small measure of aconitine has been added. An innovative method of murder, Mrs. Carstairs. And you have no idea what I was planning for you, Edmund. Catherine Carstairs turned to Holmes. Do you have a policeman waiting outside? I saw a coldness in Holmes that went beyond anything I'd ever seen before. I do indeed, Mrs. Carstairs, but I haven't finished yet. There's still the death of the boy to be accounted for. Holmes turned to her husband, who flinched. His wife regarded him curiously. That night, when you accompanied us to Mrs. Oldmore's hotel, Ross had been left on watch. When he saw us approach, at once I perceived he was terrified. He asked who you were. Watson attempted to reassure him, and in doing so both named you and gave the boy your address. That, I rather fear, was to be the death of the boy. I had assumed Ross was frightened because a murder had taken place, that he had seen the killer, and for reasons of his own had decided to keep silent. But I was wrong. What had frightened the boy was the sight of you, Mr. Carstairs, because he recognized you from the House of Silk. God knows what you had done to that child. What's the House of Silk? Catherine Carstairs asked. I won't answer your question, Mrs. Carstairs, except to say that this marriage of yours would only have worked with a certain sort of man, one who wanted a wife to give him a certain standing in society. On the first day we met, my interest was aroused when your husband told me he was late for a Wagner opera, on an evening when no Wagner was being played in town. Ross was, in all of this, the victim, but he was also old beyond his years, and poverty and desperation had driven him to crime. He'd already stolen a gold pocket watch from one of the men who'd preyed on him. When he got over the shock of encountering you, Mr. Carstairs, he must have seen the possibility of considerably more. Did he threaten to expose you if you didn't pay him a fortune? Or had you already scuttled off to Fitzsimmons and his gang of thugs and demanded that they take care of the situation? You are a man as debased and as vile as any I have ever met. Holmes rose to his feet. It occurs to me, in some ways, your marriage wasn't as ill-judged as might be thought. The two of you are made for each other. The police are waiting outside. We'll show ourselves out. Holmes never mentioned the House of Silk again. But reading the newspaper one morning, he drew my attention to a brief article concerning Chorley Grange School, which had been closed down. "It's not enough," he muttered, crumpling the paper in both hands. Then added, "Poor Ross." That evening he announced he was going out, and refused my offer to accompany him. The following day, in the evening paper, I saw a report of a great fire on Hamworth Hill. A building that had once been occupied by a charitable school had been razed to the ground. I asked no questions, nor did I remark to Holmes that his coat carried about it a strange smell of cinders. That evening he played his Stradivarius for the first time in a while. I listened with pleasure to the soaring tune as we sat together on either side of the hearth. I hear it still, as I lay down my pen and take to my bed. The style is unmistakable. It's Sherlock Holmes who's playing. It must be. I hope that he's playing for me.
Derek Jacobi has been reading The House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz. The programme was abridged and produced for BBC Radio 4 by Jane Marshall Productions. On Monday night, we begin the first of 5 readings taken from Polly Sampson's short story collection entitled Perfect Lives, the new book at bedtime.